Hello, good evening, and how are you? I have good news. I finally finished the Pauline Epistles, so I'm going to give my little summation of them and some other things. So the Pauline Epistles are the epistles which were written or thought to have been written by Paul. The thought to have been written is important because the last one, they're arranged very interestingly in the scriptures. They're arranged mostly by order of length. They aren't entirely by order of length because... which is a weird way to do it, first off. And second off, because Galatians is shorter than Ephesians, and then when they get to the personal epistles as opposed to the group epistles, so like Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians, those are all written groups of people. Then when you get back to Timothy, Timothy is larger than the ones preceding it because, yeah, they're generally the ones before are bigger than the ones after, except for, this is where things get weird, Hebrews. Hebrews is its own case. The King James Version does title it, and this continues in our LDS scriptures, as the Epistle of Paul to the Hebrews. But even in the early days of the church, even in the ante-Nicene days, most people didn't think it was Paul who wrote it. Some of the ideas are very Pauline in nature, but the style, the rhetoric, and the composition structure is very, very much unlike Paul. It lacks a lot of the features that Paul's epistles have, and it's so smooth and stylish, and so it's really interesting. The Epistle of the Hebrews is probably, theologically and soteriologically speaking, the most important of the epistles, yet we don't know who wrote it. I mean, even back in the ante-Nicene days, 200, 300 AD, there were multiple theories of who it was, whether it was Paul or Clement or the other Clement or Eusebius or a few of the others. No one really knew who wrote it. And so it's both an interesting thing and a cool thing that this incredibly important, doctrinally rich, and really beautiful epistle we don't know who wrote it. And that's cool. What else is cool is that, so it deals with the relationship and the connection between the old law of the Old Testament and the new law of the New Testament. It deals with the connections between the two, with the ways that Christ fulfills the law of Moses, that the law of Christ supersedes that law of Moses, and the connections between the rituals of the tabernacle and the temple, and what it was that Christ went through, and what it is that we need to go through in order to be exalted by him and with him. It also... Sorry, I'm outside and there's bugs, and if we want to, considering the topic of that was, this is a really good place to have just finished reading the book of Hebrews. Read all of it, except for the first couple chapters. I'm probably going to go back and reread those after this. So, anyway, I had more about it to say, but I can't remember now. Because, now I'm just remembering how pretty it is outside and what a nice day it is, and there's an airplane flying by, and there's other people wandering the ground, so I'm feeling awkward. I hate it when I lose my train of thought. Hebrews is great overall. Hebrews 11 is probably the most famous chapter. It is a discourse on faith, very comparable to what was given in Corinthians on charity. It lists through, it's a very Hebraic book. We are pretty sure whoever was the author of the book, whether it was Paul or somebody else, it was probably written in the early 60s AD. It might have been a little later, but it was most definitely written, well, most probably written, I should say, before the destruction of the Temple at Jerusalem, because it refers to the ordinances which occur in the temple in the present tense. It's unlikely that somebody would have written that in the past, would have written that in the present tense after the destruction. There are also references to it in early things, And it was accepted as a canonical gospel, or as a canonical work of Scripture early on, even though, again, nobody was really quite sure who wrote it. King James Version, it does say, the Epistle of Paul the Apostle to the Hebrews, but that was one of those consensus things, which is why it's at the end of the epistles of Paul instead of up towards the front with Thessalonians and whatnot, that they were unsure who did it. You should wave to the person who's walking behind me. I would. See? There he is. And along with that, it's pretty. Go and read it. I meant to pull out specific verses that I loved, but when I read entire chapters, they start to blur together. I've been told in the past, and I meant to look this up before coming here, but I forgot, and I'll probably look it up and post it on the page later, that when leaders of the church in the modern era have referred to it, they've referred to it not as an epistle of Paul, but they refer to the author of the Epistle of the Hebrews or whatever else. Regardless, that doesn't really matter, because the stuff in it is great. And there is, of course, sand, but there's a lot of gold too, since that post of mine reminding folks about what Eyring said was a year ago. Thanks, Facebook. Other things. I made other notes about... Let me look at my other notes in my phone. Of other things the Pauline epistles talk about. They're pretty great in general. I made a note to talk about how Colossians chapter breaks are awkward. Oh, that is a good one. Colossians chapter breaks are awkward. They're really awkward. And what else is awkward is Colossae is a place that we're really not sure where it is. We have a general idea of where it is. We know that it was somewhere inland in Turkey. Paul must have visited there, or at least we assume that Paul visited there because he wrote an epistle to them and talks about how great they were. But we don't really know for sure where it is. We know, general areas, towns that are near it, but it doesn't exist anymore. It was one of those towns that was kind of wiped from the map. The chapter breaks are really, really weird because it seems like every chapter break happens in the middle of a pericope somewhere, which is annoying. Most of the Pauline epistles, this is where we are. Most of the Pauline epistles, in contrast to the book of the Hebrews, are full of reproof. They're very much about correcting specific points, and Paul points out the specific points that he's correcting, which he doesn't do in the Epistle of the Hebrews very much, or whoever wrote it, I should say. An exception to this is the Epistle to the Philippians. The Epistle to the Philippians is lovely, and Paul speaks in such glowing and kind... He speaks kindly of most of the people that he speaks to. He does speak to them reprovingly. He doesn't speak so kindly of women, or of some... Yeah, Paul is Paul, and we love him. But the Philippians is fantastic, and even in the introduction in Philippians, Paul says something which it reminds me of Moses. It's a really pretty saying, and he says that, gosh, I wish I could remember the quote exactly. He basically says that if he could be judged, if his salvation depended upon God's judgment of the Philippians. In other words, if Paul wasn't judged on his own merits, but was judged on the merits of the Philippians, and how well they stayed in line with the gospel, how well they served each other, loved each other, how well they were doing at living the higher law of Christ, he'd be totally satisfied with that, because they were just such phenomenal converts that he doesn't have any real reproof to give them. There's the little here and there thingies of small problems that they need to correct, but on the whole, he loves the Philippians. And it's such a pretty thing to read, because after the Corinthians get slammed on they're doing this, and the others get slammed on that, and there's the stuff in the Romans that I talked about before, about not eating sacrifice to idols, which comes up a lot more in the other scriptures. But it's, gosh, the way that he talks to the Philippians is great. And if I could look up right now, it's dark, so I can't read the specific things that he says. I'm just rambling, so we should probably just end this, and we're almost at 10 minutes, which is my soft cap for these videos. I'm really grateful to know that, and Paul's one of those times where Paul is very much a creature of his time. He and Peter, they're references directly to how they don't get along with each other. They're a lot alike each other. Paul is impulsive at times in the way Peter is. He's also remarkably reticent at times in a way that Peter is. There are a lot of similarities between the two of them. Paul seems to have not gotten along with Peter or a lot of the other apostles. You see his change over the course of the book of Acts, and also you see the ways that he has changed, and his gospel knowledge and his way of dealing with things has changed and matured over the scriptures. And that's one of those things that I like about having read all the Pauline epistles in a chunk pretty close together over the last 3 months or so, is just how you can see that these men are not static. I mean, even they change. They recognize that the people that they're ministering to change. They change their attitudes. Paul even goes into this where he says a few times in a few different ways. There's the one specific where he says, I became all things to all people. He recognizes that not everybody needs the same version. I mean, version might not be the right word, but the same dose of the gospel. The Philippians can get a different formulation. I think dose is a good word, different dosage than the Ephesians can, because their level of understanding is greater. They can get more meat and less milk, as it were. And maybe that's why the Hebrews just feel so different. If it was in fact Paul who wrote it, he's writing to people who know the law of Moses, which is not true for most of the rest of his things, since he primarily preaches to the Greeks, the Hellenes, the non-Jewish converts. And he can go into a much more rabbinical and a much deeper discussion of the law and its beauty, writing in a more familiar style than he does to others. That might be part of it, I don't know. This is just the Gospel according to Jacob, of course. But I would encourage you to read the Pauline epistles. I'd encourage you to read all of the New Testament. It's fantastic. And I'm going to stop rambling, and I'm going to go home. Even though it's gorgeous, and I might just want to sleep here. But then I'll get in trouble, because there are cameras here now, and that takes the fun out of life. Have a good night. Love you, bye.